Jonathan Hale carefully reviewed the last batch of documents passed to him by Ryan Brooks, ensuring everything was in place for a crucial portfolio handover. Among the most prominent assets was one belonging to Victor Steele, a self-made billionaire infamous for his audacious business tactics. Vince, as he was often called by those in his inner circle, had mastered the art of leveraging his immense fortune to orchestrate ruthless corporate takeovers. His strategy was simple: seize control, strip assets for profit, and move on without concern for those left picking up the pieces. Jonathan, acting as both Vince's lawyer and the gatekeeper of his legal affairs, had kept him on a tight leash, ensuring he stayed within the boundaries of the law. By doing so, Vince avoided the prying eyes of federal regulators, allowing his empire to flourish. This arrangement also brought tremendous success to Hale, Reed, and Harris LLP, the law firm Jonathan co-founded with Nicole Reed and Michael Harris. Ryan, meanwhile, was steadily taking over the firm's client portfolios under Jonathan's supervision. This marked the final phase of a meticulous 3-month transition, with only Jonathan's select special clients remaining under his care. Very few knew of Jonathan's impending retirement. Only Nicole, Michael, and Ryan were privy to the plan. Jonathan had always been a man of purpose and precision. When he and his partners founded the firm, it had been a modest operation. Now it was among the most prestigious in Columbus, Ohio. Yet, Jonathan was never one to linger on sentimentality. His focus was always forward. While others might bask in personal milestones, Jonathan saw them as checkpoints. Nothing more. His wife, Alexandra, however, seemed to lack that same drive. Though their marriage had lasted over 20 years, Jonathan had little patience for her increasingly distant attitude. Their 2 children, Daniel and Emily, were thriving in college, testament to Jonathan's unwavering commitment to providing for his family. Alexandra's excuses for her waning interest in their relationship had worn thin. She'd once claimed it was a phase, promising to discuss it with her doctor. A year later, nothing had changed. Jonathan chose not to indulge her anymore. If she didn't want to match his energy, he would not waste his time chasing her attention. Alexandra's frequent trips to Mansfield, Ohio, only added to his growing irritation. She insisted these visits were necessary to care for her mother and support her sister, Bianca, who lived there. Bianca, recently divorced and perpetually struggling, relied heavily on Alexandra for support. These bi-weekly trips, which began 6 months ago, had become routine, with Alexandra leaving every Thursday and returning late Sunday. While she made a show of calling him each evening at 9 o'clock, Jonathan saw through the facade. He never liked being left to handle things alone, but he wouldn't beg her to stay. This morning, as Alexandra packed for yet another weekend away, Jonathan had mentioned he was planning a surprise for her in a couple of weeks. He even let slip that Nicole Reed was involved, a calculated move to stir some curiosity, or perhaps jealousy. Alexandra's lackluster response only reinforced his resolve. If she wasn't interested in what he was building, that was her loss. With a curt goodbye, Jonathan left for work, knowing she'd be gone by the time he returned. Later that afternoon, Jonathan wrapped up his tasks efficiently, stopping briefly to speak with his secretary, Samantha, before making his way to Nicole Reed's office. Knocking once before entering, he greeted her with a nod and proposed they wrap up for the day over a drink. Nicole, ever professional, declined, explaining that her husband Eric was waiting for her, so they could attend their son's school play. Their son, Eric Jr., was starring in Pirates of Doom, and Nicole was looking forward to it. Jonathan smirked. A school play, huh? Let me guess. Eric Jr. is the best pirate ever to hit the stage. Nicole chuckled. Naturally. We parents are supposed to think that, right? Jonathan shook his head. Well, enjoy it. I'll see you Monday. With that, he headed out, focused and composed, ready to tackle the weekend on his own terms. Married for over a decade, Nicole Reed reassured Jonathan that everything regarding the project was progressing smoothly. When Jonathan offered to involve Ryan Brooks to assist, Nicole declined, explaining that the team had everything under control. Concerned about Jonathan's impending retirement, she expressed her hesitation and tried to talk him out of it. You've been the backbone of this firm, Jonathan. Are you sure you're ready to let go? She asked. her tone sincere. Jonathan, ever pragmatic, dismissed her concerns. Nicole, you, Michael, and the younger team members are more than capable. You'll carry this firm forward without missing a beat. He complimented her leadership and acknowledged the dedication of the next generation, specifically mentioning Ryan. He even hinted at the possibility of offering Alice Chambers a partnership in the near future. Nicole nodded, adding her admiration for both Ryan and Alice. They're solid assets. Oh, and Raj confirmed he'll be at the party. Jonathan welcomed the update, then bid her good night. I'll see you tomorrow, he said, heading out with the same calm determination that defined him. The drive to his estate in the Columbus suburbs was quiet and uneventful, giving Jonathan a moment to reflect. The 5-acre property, featuring a 5,000-square-foot house, a luxurious pool with a hot tub, a cabana, 2 tennis courts, and a meticulously landscaped garden, had been his pride for years. But with the children now in college, Alexandra had insisted the house was too large for just the two of them. She had proposed downsizing to something more practical, a suggestion Jonathan was beginning to entertain, provided the move aligned with his timeline, not hers. Pulling into the 4-car garage, Jonathan parked and stepped inside the kitchen. Without a word, he retrieved a frozen dinner, set it in the microwave, and went upstairs to change into something more comfortable. As he came back down, the landline phone rang. Glancing at the clock, he noted it was too early for Alexandra to call. Curious, he picked it up. The call was about his boat, a 32-foot powered sailboat docked at Lake Erie during the summer months and stored in the winter. Jonathan had already finalized the sale with a prospective buyer who had taken the boat for a test run, and this conversation was merely to confirm details. A cashier's check would be sent to the P.O. box Jonathan provided, and once received, the title would be transferred at the marina. He hung up satisfied. The boat had been a point of contention between him and Alexandra for years. She'd never been fond of it and hadn't joined him for a single trip in the past decade. One less thing for her to complain about, Jonathan thought as he grabbed a beer from the fridge. Alongside the recent sales of his Jaguar and Audi to high bidders, the boat's sale marked yet another step toward tying up loose ends before his retirement. After mechanically finishing his dinner, Jonathan made his way to the entertainment room. He grabbed a cold bottle of Miller Lite and settled onto the leather sofa, flipping through channels before settling on a movie. The uninspired plot and lackluster performances failed to hold his interest, but Jonathan wasn't particularly invested. His mind wandered to other matters, things that actually deserved his attention. At 9 o'clock sharp, the phone rang again. This time, it was Alexandra. Her tone was cheerful as she informed him that her trip had gone smoothly and her mother's condition was slightly improved. Bianca, though, she stressed out. I might stay an extra day if that's all right with you, she suggested casually. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. Do what you need to do, he replied firmly, his tone leaving no room for debate. Just make sure everything's sorted there. I got things covered here. She went on to mention that she'd brought enough essentials to extend her stay and would be fine. The conversation turned briefly to the surprise Jonathan had hinted at earlier. What's the surprise you keep mentioning? You're being awfully secretive, she asked, her voice lacking genuine curiosity. Jonathan smirked to himself. You'll find out soon enough. Don't bother prying. You'll ruin it for yourself. After a brief exchange, Jonathan ended the call. While Alexandra's indifference no longer surprised him, it solidified his resolve. Everything he was planning, his retirement, the move, and even the adjustments to their lifestyle, would happen on his terms. He leaned back on the sofa, letting the silence of the house settle around him. With a firm gaze, he thought, if she doesn't recognize what she has, that's her problem, not mine. Earlier that evening, Alexandra had seemed unusually curious about the surprise Jonathan had mentioned weeks ago. While Jonathan found her sudden interest unexpected, he didn't let it show. Calmly, he assured her that everything was progressing on schedule, with Nicole Reed nearly finished with her part and the remaining details already in place. Alexandra promised to call him the following night before ending the conversation with a perfunctory, "I love you." Jonathan noted her eagerness to end the call quickly, her words lacking warmth. He simply responded with a curt good night before hanging up, dismissing her behavior as typical. As he sat back, Jonathan reflected briefly on Alexandra's family. Her mother and sister, Bianca, had always seemed more like burdens than anything else. Bianca's scandalous divorce after being caught cheating was hardly surprising. She had always struck Jonathan as selfish and untrustworthy, and Alexandra's consistent involvement with her sister's problems often irritated him. Another weekend alone, Jonathan thought, shaking his head. Refusing to waste time dwelling on the matter, he picked up the phone and called his children, Daniel and Emily. The conversation was lively, lasting over an hour as they shared stories from college and caught up on their plans for the upcoming visit in 2 weeks. Jonathan made it clear that their presence was non-negotiable, reminding them to clear their schedules. After the call, he allowed himself to relax. Falling asleep on the couch, he woke up in the middle of the night with a stiff neck, muttering a curse under his breath before heading to bed. That night, his sleep was unusually peaceful, an absence of dreams he found refreshing. The next 2 weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Jonathan worked tirelessly to wrap up his final cases and ensure Ryan Brooks was fully prepared to handle the transition. He spent the latter half of the second week contacting his long-standing clients, informing them of his retirement. Most expressed happiness for him, though a few required additional assurances from Nicole or Michael, which Jonathan arranged without hesitation. By the time Alexandra left for Mansfield on Thursday, the transition was nearly complete. True to form, she hadn't inquired about his work or the surprise he'd mentioned, and Jonathan hadn't bothered to bring it up again. Friday marked Jonathan's final day at the firm, and it was a busy one. With Samantha's assistance, he cleared out his office, transferred files to Ryan, and redirected all his calls to his successor. Jonathan's precision and foresight ensured that the handover went seamlessly. He had even reassigned Samantha to Ryan months earlier, knowing her experience would ease the transition. By lunchtime, Jonathan instructed Nicole to initiate the next steps of the firm's plan for the celebration. Nicole, on her way to the courthouse for a morning appearance, confirmed that everything was ready for the retirement party at the recent hotel later that evening. Although Alexandra's absence from the event was expected, it didn't dampen the mood. Jonathan had no intention of delaying the festivities on her account. After lunch, Jonathan took care of several final tasks. He signed off on the sale of the house, coordinating with movers who had already started transporting furniture to a smaller bungalow he had selected for their next chapter. The remaining pieces would be handled by the cleaning crew he'd hired to prepare the property for showings. The realtors assured him that the house, competitively priced for a quick sale, would be listed by the weekend. Jonathan's meticulous financial planning had also been executed flawlessly. Over the years, he had maintained separate accounts alongside their joint ones, a decision rooted in practicality and control. While Alexandra had always managed their household finances with diligence, she remained unaware of Jonathan's private business accounts. Now, as part of his preparations, Jonathan had closed all joint accounts and transferred their shared retirement savings into a new brokerage account solely under his name. He intended to manage their joint expenses in cash moving forward, ensuring complete oversight of their financial future. By mid-afternoon, everything was in place. The movers were ahead of schedule, the cleaning crew was standing by, and the realtors had already lined up interested buyers. Jonathan's efficiency left little room for error, and he was satisfied knowing that every detail had been handled with precision. He had crafted this plan carefully over the last year, and now it was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. As he prepared for the evening's event, Jonathan thought of Alexandra's reaction to the changes. She'll find out soon enough, he mused, his expression unyielding. Whether or not she appreciated his efforts was no longer his concern. He had made his decisions, and he would not be swayed. Jonathan's preparations extended beyond what Alexandra could imagine. Temporary, or so it seemed, until everything was settled, their accounts were now entirely under his control. Having established international banking arrangements in Europe and South America, Jonathan ensured their finances were protected and adaptable to their future plans. The new online accounts, secure and inaccessible to U.S. oversight, were already functioning seamlessly. Jonathan had no doubts that Alexandra, adept in managing money, would adapt quickly. However, she was unaware of the extent of their wealth, nor of the offshore investments he had meticulously cultivated over the years. Jonathan had planned every detail with precision. The tickets for their extended stay at a luxurious Costa Rican resort were in hand. It was a destination Jonathan had personally vetted during a solo visit months earlier. Nestled along the coastline, the resort promised the best of everything: sun, sand, swimming, sailing, horseback riding. It was a haven designed for relaxation and adventure, an ideal retreat to mark their new chapter. With Rachel's help, the reservations were confirmed well in advance, ensuring a smooth transition from work to leisure. Jonathan had accumulated substantial wealth during his career, handling high-profile cases for elite clients. His fees had been premium, and the returns from his investments, often in high-risk opportunities, had paid off generously. Leveraging his legal expertise, Jonathan had moved a significant portion of his assets offshore, legally and securely. These accounts, immune to U.S. tax laws and regulations, had grown into a considerable fortune over the years, a fact Alexandra would never suspect. His financial independence was by design. Jonathan had always insisted on maintaining control. While Alexandra managed their joint accounts with competence, she remained oblivious to his private dealings. Now, with the joint accounts closed and the retirement fund moved into a new brokerage account, Jonathan held the reins firmly. The retirement party at the recent hotel was a resounding success. Jonathan had always been a man who commanded respect, and the event was no exception. He danced with the women, exchanged stories with the men, and reflected on the cases that had defined his career. Ryan stayed close to him throughout the evening, absorbing every detail, while Nicole and Michael discreetly ensured the party ran smoothly. Both were aware of Jonathan's plans and had sworn to secrecy. As he shared a dance with Nicole, they discussed the final steps of his transition. "Everything's in place," Nicole assured him. "Your surprise for Alexandra is ready to go." Jonathan chuckled. "She'll enjoy it, or at least she'll have no reason not to." Nicole raised an eyebrow. "You've always been thorough, Jonathan. I wouldn't expect anything less." Toward the end of the evening, Jonathan revealed his Costa Rica plans to Nicole. "We're leaving Sunday night. I'll give her the details during our call that morning. She won't see it coming." Nicole smirked. "You know, most people would have involved their spouse in a decision like that." Jonathan's expression remained firm. "Most people don't know how to manage their lives. Alexandra will adjust. She always does." By midnight, Jonathan decided to call it a night. Checking his phone, he noticed a missed call and a voicemail from Alexandra. Her message was brief. She was staying at her mother's that evening and didn't want him to call, as it might disturb her mother's rest. She promised to call him the following night and asked if he could stay home so she could reach him easily. Jonathan listened to her words with his usual detachment. Of course, she'd make it about convenience for her, he thought. He deleted the voicemail and turned his attention to more important matters. Returning home, Jonathan got straight to work. He packed his belongings efficiently, ensuring everything he needed was ready for the move. Alexandra's things were handled with the same meticulous care, boxed and labeled to avoid any unnecessary back and forth later. The movers would finish their part the following day, and Jonathan had already arranged for a cleaning crew to prepare the house for its first showings. His new bungalow, modest yet modern, was ready and waiting. As the night stretched on, Jonathan finalized the last details of the surprise. A quick phone call confirmed that everything was in place. The anticipation of unveiling his plans filled him with quiet satisfaction. Alexandra would discover the full scope of his preparations soon enough, and when she did, there would be no room for debate. By the time he finished, the house was silent, its emptiness no longer unsettling but liberating. Jonathan sat back with a glass of whiskey, staring into the darkened room. This is how you close a chapter, he thought, his resolve unshaken. Jonathan went to bed that night, content from the success of the party, but keenly aware of the weight of the plans he would execute over the coming days. Everything was in motion now, and as he lay in the quiet bungalow, he felt the tension of the past months easing into a focused resolve. Nothing will go wrong, he thought. It's all prepared. The next morning, Saturday, the movers arrived to finalize the relocation. Jonathan supervised their progress briefly before leaving them to their work. There was no time for sentimentality over the emptying house. It was a space he had already left behind in his mind. Instead, Jonathan drove back to the bungalow to prepare for his children's arrival. Daniel and Emily were due around noon, and he intended to inform them of his retirement and the next steps. He'd kept most of the details from them thus far, ensuring there wouldn't be any disruptions to his carefully laid plans. When the kids arrived, Jonathan welcomed them warmly, but with his usual directness, he wasted no time. Sitting them down in the living room, he outlined his retirement, the move, and the upcoming trip to Costa Rica with Alexandra. Both Daniel and Emily had questions, some practical, others skeptical, but Jonathan answered each one clearly and without hesitation. "Your tuition is secured," he assured them. "You will always have a home, regardless of where that happens to be." Despite their concerns about not informing Alexandra sooner, Jonathan remained firm. "This is something your mother and I have discussed in principle. I've taken care of the details, and she'll know everything soon enough. I want this to be a positive change for everyone." Reluctantly, Daniel and Emily agreed to hold their questions until Sunday night, when Alexandra was scheduled to return. Jonathan's calm authority left little room for argument. To lighten the mood, he took them out to dinner that evening, where the conversation steered away from logistics and into familiar family banter. Later that evening, Alexandra called at her usual time, 9 p.m. The exchange was brief, as it often was, and she gave no indication of staying longer in Mansfield. Jonathan, however, wasn't surprised by the lack of substance in her words. Her quick goodbye was met with his usual measured response before he returned to his preparations. That night, after Daniel and Emily went to bed, Jonathan confirmed the final details of the move. A call to the movers verified that everything was on schedule, and the cleaning crew had already completed their work, leaving the house spotless and ready for showings. Pleased with the progress, Jonathan made one last phone call to finalize the final piece of his plans. The assurance on the other end of the line brought a faint smile to his face. Everything was in place. Sunday arrived with little to do but wait. The house was prepped, the bungalow was fully furnished, and all arrangements for Costa Rica were locked in. Daniel and Emily spent the day catching up with old friends from home, leaving Jonathan alone in the bungalow. He used the time to check his documents and go over the finer points of his plans one final time. By mid-morning, Alexandra's call came in, right on schedule. Jonathan answered after the first ring, his tone even. "Are you on your way home?" On the other end, Alexandra hesitated. "Actually, I was hoping to stay a few more days," she said, her voice strained, as though expecting an argument. "Bianca needs more time to handle a few things, and I thought I could help." Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened as months of restrained frustration boiled to the surface. He took a deep breath before responding, his voice colder than Alexandra had ever heard. "Stay a few more days, you say? With Kevin, perhaps? Or should I ask Ben instead?" The silence on the other end was deafening. Alexandra stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what you're talking about." Jonathan's anger was now fully unleashed, though he kept his tone controlled, each word cutting like a blade. "Don't lie to me, Alexandra. 6 months. 6 months of your little charades, thinking I wouldn't notice. Did you really believe I was that oblivious? Or did you simply not care?" Her silence was answer enough. Jonathan continued, his voice rising slightly, but never losing its edge. "While you've been busy playing house in Mansfield, I've been preparing. Every detail, every step, all leading to this moment. You've made your choices, Alexandra, and now I'm making mine." A sob escaped her, and then the line went dead. Jonathan stared at the phone, his grip tightening before he placed it down deliberately on the table. "She hung up," he muttered, his voice laced with contempt. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank wall in front of him. For a moment, the room was utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Rising to his feet, Jonathan poured himself a drink. He swirled the amber liquid in the glass, his expression unreadable. "Let's see how you handle the surprise now," he murmured, raising the glass to his lips. Jonathan sat in silence, the empty phone call replaying in his mind. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger had served its purpose, fueling the meticulous plans he had been crafting for months. Now, as the dust began to settle, what remained was a sense of satisfaction, cold and calculated. The pieces were in motion, and there was no turning back. As he stared at the phone in his hand, the disposable one he had purchased for this exact scenario began to ring. The sharp sound broke the stillness, reverberating against the walls of the quiet bungalow. Slowly, Jonathan picked it up and answered with a clipped, "Yes." Bianca's voice came through, shrill and accusatory. "What did you say to her, Jonathan?" "Bridget is a wreck. She's almost hysterical." "What did you do?" Jonathan's lips curled into a cold smile as he leaned back in his chair. "What did I do, Bianca? I told her to stay in Mansfield as long as she liked. Spend more time with her lover Kevin. Perhaps even make some room for Ben while she's at it." Bianca's gasp was audible, followed by stammering attempts to explain. "Jonathan, it's not what you think. This whole thing, it's a stupid mistake. She never meant for it to happen. Neither of us did." Jonathan's voice remained icy, his words cutting through her excuses like a blade. "A mistake? 6 months of sneaking around, lying, and hiding is hardly a mistake, Bianca. It's a choice. One you both made, repeatedly." "Please, Jonathan," Bianca pleaded. "Let her explain. Don't do anything drastic." "I've already done what I needed to do," Jonathan said sharply. "And for the record, your involvement makes you just as guilty. You helped cover for her. You stood by and watched while she threw away everything we built." Bianca tried to interject, but Jonathan's voice rose slightly, his tone commanding. "I've already told Daniel and Emily the truth. They deserve to know what their mother's been doing during her so-called visits to help the family. And you know what? They took it better than I expected." "You told the kids?" Bianca sounded horrified. "How could you?" "I told them because I'm not in the business of lying," Jonathan snapped. "Unlike you and your sister. You've both discarded this family for your selfish games." Bianca's pleas turned desperate. "Jonathan, you can't throw it all away. There's still hope. There has to be." Jonathan's laugh was low and bitter. "Hope? There is none, Bianca. Bridget and I are done. Tell her to say goodbye to your mother for me. I'm sure she'll be thrilled. She's never liked me anyway. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important matters to attend to." He ended the call without waiting for a response, the silence in the room now punctuated by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Placing the disposable phone on the table, he glanced around the bungalow. It was modest, efficient, everything the old house was not. Jonathan thought to himself, "Bridget will love it," before a dry chuckle escaped his lips. If only she'd earned the chance to see it. Jonathan rose and methodically turned off the lights, leaving a set of spare keys on the table alongside a letter addressed to Bridget. The letter was not an explanation. It was a statement of facts. As he shut the door behind him, the bungalow felt less like a home and more like a tomb for the life he was leaving behind. Pulling up to Rachel's apartment, Jonathan spotted her waiting on the curb with 3 suitcases at her side. He stepped out of the car, loaded her luggage into the trunk, and opened the door for her. Rachel climbed in, smiling up at him as he shut the door. As Jonathan settled into the driver's seat, Rachel spoke, her tone playful yet sincere. "You know, seeing you every day at the firm without being able to touch or talk to you is torture. But I have to give Bridget credit for throwing you away. It made it so much easier for me to scoop you up." Jonathan smirked, starting the car and pulling into the road. "She didn't throw me away, Rachel. She just didn't know how to hold on." Rachel reached for his hand, her voice soft but firm. "Well, I do." The car glided down the darkened street, leaving behind the remnants of a life Jonathan had already discarded. Rachel leaned back, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she recounted her final conversation with Bianca. "When Bridget called you to ask if she could stay a couple more days, I had this strange feeling it wouldn't go well for her. And Bianca," she laughed at the idea of Bridget staying longer. "Something about Kevin and Ben keeping her busy." Rachel laughed, her tone laced with mockery. Jonathan said nothing, his focus on the road ahead. The chapter with Alexandra was closed, and a new one had begun. This time, it would be on his terms. Alexandra's hands shook as she gripped the wheel, her knuckles white as she pushed the car to its limits. The interstate blurred past her as she replayed the conversation with Jonathan in her mind, his words striking her like blows. He knows everything, she thought, panic bubbling in her chest. Bianca's reassurances had vanished from her mind the moment Jonathan confronted her. It was no longer about salvaging the lies she had carefully constructed. It was about survival. Her world was crumbling, and she was desperate to stop the collapse. She rehearsed her apologies, her pleas, and her explanations as she sped down the highway. I'll tell him the truth, she thought. I'll beg him to forgive me. He has to listen. He has to give me another chance. But deep down, she knew. She had crossed a line, and Jonathan wasn't the type of man who tolerated betrayal. When Alexandra pulled into the driveway of their now empty house, her stomach sank. The sight of 4 cars parked outside made her heart pound with dread. She recognized the cars belonging to Daniel and Emily, and their presence filled her with a growing sense of doom. Why are they here? Did he tell them? Oh, God! What did he say? She veered onto the grass, parking haphazardly before jumping out of the car. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she ran toward the front door, her keys already in hand. A man she didn't recognize stepped out of one of the unfamiliar cars, moving to block her path. His calm demeanor only heightened her panic. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back," he said firmly, placing a hand on her arm. "Get out of my way." Alexandra snapped, shoving past him. She fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling too much to slide them into the lock. "This is my house. I need to get inside." The man didn't stop her, but his eyes followed her every move. She ignored him, finally managing to unlock the door and burst inside. The house was eerily quiet, the familiar warmth of their home replaced by an emptiness that made her breath hitch. "Jonathan," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "Daniel? Emily? Where are you?" Her words were met with silence, the oppressive stillness pressing down on her. She moved through the house, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors, each step growing heavier with dread. When she reached the dining room, she froze. On the table lay an envelope with her name written on the front in Jonathan's unmistakable handwriting. Next to it were a set of spare keys and a business card for a real estate agent. Alexandra's knees buckled, and she sank into the nearest chair, staring at the letter as though it might come alive and bite her. She reached for the envelope with trembling hands, tearing it open with desperate urgency. The letter inside was brief and to the point, typical of Jonathan's style. "Alexandra, you made your choices, and now I've made mine. Our marriage, as you knew it, is over. The house is listed, and the proceeds will be handled through the firm. My attorney will contact you with the details. Take this as an opportunity to reflect on what you've thrown away. Do not contact me. Do not contact our children. I've already told them everything. You've lost the privilege of explanations." "Jonathan." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face, dripping onto the letter. She clutched it to her chest, her mind reeling. "He's gone. He's really gone." Alexandra stumbled back outside, the letter still clutched in her hand. The man who had stopped her earlier was waiting by the door, his expression neutral but watchful. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "Where's Jonathan?" The man shook his head. "He's no longer here. That's all you need to know." Alexandra let out a ragged sob, her legs giving way as she sank to the steps. "He can't just leave. He can't do this." But the man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving her alone on the front steps, clutching the remnants of the life she had destroyed. Meanwhile, miles away, Jonathan drove steadily down a coastal road, Rachel sitting beside him. She reached over and rested her hand on his arm, her touch light but reassuring. "Do you think she's read the letter yet?" Rachel asked, her tone curious. Jonathan's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. "She has. And now, she knows exactly where we stand." Rachel smiled, leaning back in her seat. "You're incredible, Jonathan. The way you handled everything. I've never seen anyone so in control." Jonathan glanced at her briefly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Control is everything, Rachel. Without it, people make mistakes." She chuckled softly. "Well, I'm glad I chose the right side." Jonathan didn't respond, his mind already focused on the next chapter. Alexandra was part of his past, now a closed book. The future, however, was entirely in his hands. Alexandra's key scratched against the lock again and again, her trembling hands unable to make it work. When it finally became clear that the key would not fit, she let out a frustrated cry and threw it onto the porch. Holding her face in her hands, she began to sob, the weight of her actions crashing down around her. Desperation replaced any semblance of control as she turned to the door, pounding on it with her fists until the pain forced her to stop. Turning, she noticed the man who had blocked her earlier, standing silently nearby, watching her with a calm but unreadable expression. "Are you Mrs. Alexandra Hale?" he asked in a measured tone. Alexandra nodded, too defeated to speak. The man stepped forward, holding out an envelope. "You are served, ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm. She took the envelope with shaking hands, staring at it as if it might explode. The man then handed her another, smaller envelope. "These are the keys to your new residence. The address is inside, and the property is yours, free of encumbrances. You'll also find the deed and other necessary information." Her breath hitched as she clutched the two envelopes, unable to process what was happening. The man reached into his coat pocket once more, this time producing a legal-sized white envelope. "This contains several checks," he explained. "They amount to the balances of your now-closed savings and checking accounts. The house has been listed for sale, and the proceeds will go to you once the transaction is complete. All of this is detailed in the divorce agreement, which is included here." Closing his briefcase with a finality that made Alexandra flinch, the man gave her one last look. "Should you need further clarification, this is the contact information for Mr. Hale's attorney." He placed a business card on top of the envelopes, nodded, and walked away. As the man climbed into his car, Alexandra's gaze fell to the business card. Nicole Reed. The name sent a jolt of anger through her, but it quickly fizzled into despair. She had long resented Nicole, accusing her, without cause, of being too close to Jonathan. Now, she understood that her jealousy had been misplaced. Nicole wasn't the problem, Alexandra was. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, but it offered no solace. The sound of a car door closing broke her trance. Looking up, she saw Nicole herself walking toward her, dressed impeccably, her expression a mixture of pity and cool detachment. "Hello, Alexandra," Nicole said, her tone calm but cutting. "You don't look well." Alexandra's lips trembled, but no words came. "I just wanted to give you some clarity," Nicole continued. "Jonathan asked me to handle things in his absence, in case you were wondering. And since I'm sure you have questions, let me make a few things clear." Nicole crossed her arms, the movement deliberate. "First, Jonathan retired on Friday. We held a wonderful party for him, a real celebration of his career. Too bad you missed it. But then again, you had other priorities, didn't you?" Alexandra's breath caught, and Nicole pressed on without missing a beat. "Second, this house has been turned over to a realtor for sale. You signed a power of attorney years ago, and Jonathan used it to transfer the title into his name. But don't worry, the proceeds are yours. He made sure of that, even after everything you've done." The words hit Alexandra like blows, each one sharper than the last. "Third," Nicole said, stepping closer, "Jonathan has left the country, and as far as I know, he doesn't intend to return anytime soon. He's moved on, Alexandra, and that includes everything, his life, his plans, and his relationships." Nicole's gaze hardened. "You don't need to know who he's with, only that she's helping him move forward, something you made impossible." Each word from Nicole felt like a hammer, driving the stakes of Alexandra's actions deeper into her heart. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The weight of what she had done, what she had lost, pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. "I can't imagine why you did this to Jonathan," Nicole said, her voice softening slightly. "But I do know this, he loved you. For 20 years, he loved you more than anything. When he found out what you were doing, it shattered him." Nicole's voice grew firmer. "Roger and I kept him grounded, reminded him of his children. That's the only reason he didn't do something rash. But you should know, Alexandra, it nearly broke him. And now he's done. You don't get to talk to him." You don't get to fight this. The divorce is final, and I'll handle everything from here. Nicole turned and walked away without another word, leaving Alexandra rooted to the spot. She climbed into the passenger side of the car, which pulled away moments later. Alexandra turned to face her children, who had been watching from the driveway. Their expressions were unreadable, but the pain and disappointment in their eyes were unmistakable. As she approached them, her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Jake reached down to help her up, his face cold and distant. "Come on, Mom. Stand up." Alexandra looked into his eyes and saw nothing but anger and disgust. Tessa stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mirror of her brother's. The weight of their judgment was unbearable. "I'm sorry," Alexandra whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." But her words hung in the air, unanswered. For the first time in her life, she truly understood the cost of her choices. She had lost her husband, her family, and the life she had taken for granted. And there was no one to blame but herself. As she glanced back at the house, the home that had once been her sanctuary, she realized it was all gone. Everything she had built, everything she had loved, was now just a memory.